I wanted to finish my little project here with Pig, the story. Um, but I don't really have much else to say these days. Prepping for Italy, working on some small films, some short projects, a couple corporate gigs here and there. Working on L'Elisir d'Amour for operatic purposes. And, just generally taking it easy, living large. So, to all the friends, fans out there, hope life's going well for you. And now the conclusion of Pig.
The whole world is before me, our hero cried as he emerged into the street. I now have $15,000 to see me through until my book is published, and after that, of course, I shall have a great deal more. He stood on used pavement, wondering which way to go. He turned left and began strolling slowly down the street, staring at the sights of the city. What a revolting smell, he said, sniffing the air. I can't stand this. His delicate olfactory nerves, tuned to receive only the most delicious kitchen aromas, were being tortured by the stench of the diesel oil fumes pouring out of the backs of buses. I must get out of this place before my nose is ruined altogether, he said. But first, I've simply got to have something to eat. I'm starving. The poor boy had nothing but berries and wild herbs for the past 2 weeks, and now his stomach was yearning for solid food. I'd like a nice hominy cutlet, he told himself, or maybe a few juicy salsify fritters. He crossed the street and entered a small restaurant. The place was hot inside and dark and silent. There was a strong smell of cooking fat and cabbage water. The only other customer was a man with a brown hat on his head, crouching intently over his food, who did not look up as Lexington came in. Our hero seated himself at a corner table and hung his knapsack on the back of his chair. This, he told himself, is going to be most interesting. In all my 17 years, I have tasted only the cooking of 2 people, Aunt Glosspan and myself, unless one counts Nurse McPottle, who must have heated my bottle a few times when I was an infant. But I am now about to sample the art of a new chef altogether, and perhaps, if I'm lucky, I may pick up a couple of useful ideas for my book. A waiter approached out of the shadows at the back and stood beside the table. How do you do? How do you do, Lexington said. I should like a large hominy cutlet. Please, do it 25 seconds each side in a very hot skillet with sour cream, and sprinkle a pinch of lovage on it before serving. Unless, of course, your chef knows a more original method, in which case I should be delighted to try it. The waiter laid his head over to one side and looked carefully at his customer. You want the roast pork and cabbage? He asked. That's all we have left. Roast what and cabbage? The waiter took a soiled handkerchief from his trouser pocket and shook it open with a violent flourish as though he were cracking a whip. Then he blew his nose loud and wet. You want it or don't you? He said, wiping his nostrils. I haven't the foggiest idea what it is, Lexington replied. But I should love to try it. You see, I am writing a cooking book and... One pork and cabbage, the waiter shouted, and somewhere in the back of the restaurant, far away in the darkness, a voice answered him. The waiter disappeared. Lexington reached into his knapsack for his personal knife and fork. These were a present from Aunt Glosspan, given him when he was 6 years old, made of solid silver, and he had never eaten with any other instrument since. While waiting for the food to arrive, he polished them lovingly with a piece of soft muslin. Soon the waiter returned carrying a plate on which there lay a thick grayish-white slab of something hot. Lexington leaned forward anxiously to smell it as it was put down before him. His nostrils were wide open to receive the scent, quivering and sniffing. But this is absolute heaven, he exclaimed. What an aroma! It's tremendous! The waiter stepped back a pace, watching his customer carefully. Never in my life have I smelled anything as rich and wonderful as this," our hero cried, seizing his knife and fork. "What on earth is it made of?" The man in the brown hat looked around and stared, then returned to his eating. The waiter was backing away towards the kitchen. Lexington cut off a small piece of the meat, impaled it on his silver fork, and carried it up to his nose so as to smell it again. Then he popped it into his mouth and began to chew it slowly, his eyes half closed, his body tensed. "This is fantastic," he cried. "It is a brand new flavor. Oh, Glosspan, my beloved aunt, how I wish you were with me so you could taste this remarkable dish. Waiter, come here at once. I want you." The astonished waiter was now watching from the other end of the room and seemed reluctant to move any closer. "If you will come and talk to me, I will give you a present," Lexington said, waving a $100 bill. "Please come over here and talk to me." The waiter sidled cautiously back to the table, snatched away the money, and held it up to his face, peering at it from all angles. Then he slipped it quietly into his pocket. "What can I do for you, my friend?" "Look," Lexington said, "if you will tell me what this delicious dish is made of and exactly how it is prepared, I will give you another 100. "I already told you," the man said. "It's pork." "And exactly what is pork?" "You never had roast pork before?" the waiter asked, staring. "For heaven's sake, man, tell me what it is and stop keeping me in suspense like this." "It's pig," the waiter said. "You just bung it in the oven." "Pig?" "All pork is pig. Didn't you know that?" "You mean this is pig's meat?" "I guarantee it. But that's impossible," the youth stammered. "Aunt Glosspan, who knew more about food than anyone else in the world, said that meat of any kind was disgusting, revolting, horrible, foul, nauseating, and beastly. And yet, this piece that I have here on my plate is without doubt the most delicious thing that I have ever tasted. Now, how on earth do you explain that? Aunt Glosspan certainly wouldn't have told me it was revolting if it wasn't." "Maybe your aunt didn't know how to cook it," the waiter said. "Is that possible?" "You're damn right it is, especially with pork. Pork has to be very well done or you can't eat it." "Eureka!" Lexington cried. "I'll bet that's exactly what happened. She did it wrong." He handed the man another $100 bill. "Lead me to the kitchen," he said. "Introduce me to the genius who prepared this meat." Lexington was at once taken to the kitchen, and there he met the cook, who was an elderly man with a rash on the side of his neck. "This will cost you another 100, the waiter said. Lexington was only too glad to oblige, but this time he gave the money to the cook. "Now listen to me," he said. "I have to admit that I am really rather confused by what the waiter has just been telling me. Are you quite sure that the delectable dish which I have been eating was prepared from pig's flesh?" The cook raised his right hand and began scratching the rash on his neck. "Well," he said, looking at the waiter and giving him a sly wink, "all I can tell you is that I think it was pig's meat." "You mean you're not sure?" "One can never be sure." "Then what else could it have been?" "Well," the cook said, speaking very slowly and still staring at the waiter, "there's just 9 chances, you see, that it might have been a piece of human stuff." "You mean a man?" "Yes." "Good heavens! Or a woman. It could have been either. They both taste the same." "Well, now you really do surprise me," the youth declared. "One lives and learns. Indeed one does. As a matter of fact, we've been getting an awful lot of it just lately from the butchers in place of pork," the cook declared. "Have you really?" "The trouble is, it's almost impossible to tell which is which. They're both very good." "The piece I had just now was simply superb." "I'm glad you like it," the cook said. "But to be quite honest, I think that it was a bit of pig. In fact, I'm almost sure it was." "You are?" "Yes, I am. In that case, we shall have to assume that you're right, Lexington said. So now will you please tell me, and here's another $100 for your trouble, will you please tell me precisely how you prepared it? The cook, after pocketing the money, launched upon a colorful description of how to roast a loin of pork, while the youth, not wanting to miss a single word of so great a recipe, sat down at the kitchen table and recorded every detail in his notebook. Is that all? He asked when the cook was finished. That's all. But there must be more to it than that, surely. You gotta get a good piece of meat to start off with, the cook said. That's half the battle. It's gotta be a good hog and it's gotta be butchered right. Otherwise it'll turn out lousy, whichever way you cook it. Show me how, Lexington said. Butcher me one so I can learn. We don't butcher pigs in the kitchen, the cook said. That lot you just ate came from the packing house over in the Bronx. Then give me the address. The cook gave him the address, and our hero, after thanking them both many times for their kindness, rushed outside and leapt into a taxi and headed for the Bronx. The packing house was a big 4-story brick building, and the air around it smelled sweet and heavy like musk. At the packing house was a big 4-story brick building, and the air around it smelled sweet and heavy like musk. At the main entrance gates there was a large notice which said, "Visitors welcome at any time," and thus encouraged, Lexington walked through the gates and entered a cobbled yard which surrounded the building itself. Then he followed a series of signposts, this way for the guided tours, and came eventually to a small corrugated iron shed well set apart from the main building, visitors' waiting room. After knocking politely on the door, he went in. There were 6 other people ahead of him in the waiting room. There was a fat mother with her 2 little boys aged about 9 and 11. There was a bright young couple who looked as though they might be on their honeymoon, and there was a pale woman with long white gloves who sat very upright, looking straight ahead, with her hands folded in her lap. Nobody spoke. Lexington wondered whether they were all writing cookbooks like himself, but when he put this question to them aloud, he got no answer. The grown-ups merely smiled mysteriously to themselves and shook their heads, and the 2 children stared at him as though they were seeing a lunatic. Soon, the door opened, and a man with a merry pink face popped his head into the room and said, "Next, please." The mother and the 2 boys got up and went out. About 10 minutes later, the same man returned. "Next, please," he said again, and the honeymoon couple jumped up and followed him outside. 2 new visitors came in and sat down, a middle-aged husband and a middle-aged wife, the wife carrying a wicker shopping basket containing groceries. "Next, please," said the guide, and the woman with the long white gloves got up and left. Several more people came in and took their place on the stiff-backed wooden chairs. Soon the guide returned for the 4th time, and now it was Lexington's turn to go outside. "Follow me, please," the guide said, leading the youth across the yard towards the main building. "How exciting this is!" Lexington cried, hopping from one foot to the other. "I only wish dear Aunt Glasspan could be with me now to see what I am going to see." "I myself only do the preliminaries," the guide said. "Then I shall hand you over to someone else." "Anything you say!" cried the ecstatic youth. First, they visited a large, penned-in area at the back of the building where several hundred pigs were wandering around. "Here's where they start," the guide said, "and over there's where they go in." "Where?" "Right there." The guide pointed to a long wooden shed that stood against the outside wall of the factory. "We call it the shackling pen. This way, please." 3 men wearing long rubber boots were driving a dozen pigs into the shackling pen just as Lexington and the guide approached, so they all went in together. "Now," the guide said, "watch how they shackle them." Inside, the shed was simply a bare wooden room with no roof, and there was a steel cable with hooks on it that kept moving slowly along the length of one wall, parallel to the ground, about 3 feet up. When it reached the end of the shed, this cable suddenly changed direction and climbed vertically upward through the open roof towards the top floor of the main building. The 12 pigs were huddled together at the far end of the pen, standing quietly, looking apprehensive. One of the men in rubber boots pulled a length of metal chain down from the wall and advanced upon the nearest animal, approaching it from the rear. Then he bent down and quickly looped one end of the chain around one of the animal's hind legs. The other end attached to a hook on the moving cable as it went by. The cable kept moving. The chain tightened. The pig's leg was pulled up and back, and then the pig itself began to be dragged backwards. But it didn't fall down. It was a rather nimble pig, and somehow it managed to keep its balance on 3 legs, hopping from foot to foot and struggling against the pull of the chain, but going back and back all the time until at the end of the pen, where the cable changed direction, it went vertically upward. The creature was suddenly jerked off its feet and borne aloft. Shrill protests filled the air. "Truly a fascinating process," Lexington said. "But what was the funny cracking noise it made as it went up?" "Probably the leg," the guide answered. "Either that or the pelvis." "But doesn't that matter?" "Why should it matter?" the guide asked. "You don't eat the bones." The rubber-booted men were busy shackling up the rest of the pigs, and one after another they were hooked to the moving cable and hoisted up through the roof, protesting loudly as they went. "There's a good deal more to this recipe than just picking herbs," Lexington said. "Aunt Glasspen would never have made it." At this moment, while Lexington was gazing skyward at the last pig to go up, a man in rubber boots approached him quietly from behind and looped one end of a chain around the youth's own ankle, hooking the other end to the moving belt. The next moment, before he had time to realize what was happening, our hero was jerked off his feet and dragged backwards along the concrete floor of the shackling pen. "Stop!" he cried. "Hold everything! My leg's caught!" But nobody seemed to hear him, and 5 seconds later, the unhappy young man was jerked off the floor and hoisted vertically upward through the open roof of the pen, dangling upside down by one angle and wriggling like a fish. "Help!" he shouted. "Help! There's been a frightful mistake! Stop the engines! Let me down!" The guide removed a cigar from his mouth and looked up serenely at the rapidly ascending youth, but he said nothing. The men in rubber boots were already on their way out to collect the next batch of pigs. "Oh, save me!" our hero cried. "Let me down! Please let me down!" But he was now approaching the top floor of the building, where the moving belt curled like a snake and entered a large hole in the wall, a kind of doorway without a door. And there, on the threshold, waiting to greet him, clothed in a dark, stained yellow rubber apron, and looking all the world like St. Peter at the gates of heaven, the sticker stood. Lexington saw him only from upside down, and very briefly at that, but even so he noticed at once the expression of absolute peace and benevolence on the man's face, the cheerful twinkle in the eyes, the little wistful smile, the dimple in his cheeks. And all this gave him hope. "Hi there," the sticker said, smiling. "Quick! Save me!" our hero cried. "With pleasure," the sticker said, and taking Lexington gently by one ear with his left hand, he raised his right hand and deftly slid open the boy's jugular vein with a knife. The belt moved on. Lexington went with it. Everything was still upside down, and the blood was pouring out of his throat and getting into his eyes, but he could still see after a fashion, and he had a blurred impression of being in an enormously long room, and at the far end of the room there was a great smoking cauldron of water, and there were dark figures, half hidden in the steam, dancing around the edge of it, brandishing long poles. The conveyor belt seemed to be traveling right over the top of the cauldron, and the pigs seemed to be dropping one by one into the boiling water, and one of the pigs seemed to be wearing long white gloves on its front feet. Suddenly, our hero started to feel very sleepy, but it wasn't until his good, strong heart had pumped the last drop of blood from his body that he passed on out of this the best of all possible worlds into the next.